Hi BookTube, it's Amy. So just before I go and take my seat here in this new chair, I thought I would show you the chair. Nice and cozy in my reading corner here. And I've got my old orange chair still on the other side of things. This pillow was sort of bought on a whim. I have a weird attraction to things that look like they should belong to somebody's grandmother. And so this throw pillow cover really caught my eye, and I always love roses, so that's definitely my aesthetic there. So this is a Friday Reads, but I haven't really read a whole lot this past week. It's been a fairly stressful week in terms of work. I found out just about a week ago that my immediate team was being moved to another part in the organization, and that the file I was working on was being left behind, and nobody would tell me or the other guy who was working on the file with me whether we were moving with our team to this new section in the organization or whether we were essentially being left behind with the file. And I found out yesterday that we're being left behind with the file, and in fact we're moving under new management come Monday. So a little bit stressful there, a little bit disappointing that I didn't get a choice, and that it wasn't conveyed in, I guess, a very respectful way. But needless to say, that's settled. I am going there for the time being, keeping my eye out for other opportunities. It's definitely a beer kind of Friday. I've got this Clock Tower Brew Pub raspberry wheat beer. I ordered myself a 6-pack through Skip the Dishes here, and of course, because it was through Skip the Dishes, I had to order it with food, and so I got donut holes with caramel sauce, just so that I could get the beer delivered. And the donuts were delicious. Now I'm starting in on the beer. But on to the books, beer and books here today on this Friday. I have still been meandering my way through this biography of Hugh Thompson by M.H. Spielman and Walter Gerald. I finally got into the chapter between the period of 1910 and 1915 where the author is going to talk about Thompson's illustration of J.M. Barrie. I've discovered he illustrated a number of wonderful works, including a number of Jane Austen novels. And then, of course, I've been reading Balzac as well. Tomorrow, the next video in my series on Balzac will be posted. That will be the Sobol. And I haven't started reading The Purse yet, but that's probably on my agenda for tomorrow. Tomorrow's Saturday, and I think it would be nice to crack open another one of these beers, sit down with some Balzac, and spend a relaxing Saturday that way. And then I didn't plan well here. I've got everything stacked up on itself. Moving this stack aside to the Stephen King. So last Thursday night or Friday night, I forget which, but I sat down, or rather I lay down, and I read the first story in the new Stephen King collection, If It Bleeds. And this is called Mr. Harrigan's Phone. And I think it was one of my favorite shorter works by Stephen King, if not one of my favorite works by Stephen King that I've ever read. Essentially, it's about a young man who, as a boy and a teenager, goes to read aloud to this very wealthy gentleman in town. He becomes very close with this gentleman, and it's set in the 2000s, and so he introduces Mr. Harrigan to his very first cell phone. And Mr. Harrigan is, at first he doesn't want anything to do with phones. He thinks it's just going to take up so much of his time. But then he realizes that you can see stock prices in the stock market in real time, and that he can see all his favorite magazines and periodicals the day that they come out. And he really comes to love this phone, and then he dies, and our main character continues to grow up But some strange things begin to happen. Our main character's name is Craig, and just mysterious events, and he is texting this phone that he has slipped into the pocket in the coffin with Mr. Harrigan when he was buried, and he begins to text, as a therapeutic way, but then he gets some messages back, and things begin to happen that lead him to wonder if something supernatural is going on, and I quite liked it. Because not only did we have this supernatural horror element, but I think it was an interesting look at the impact that technology has on contemporary society. And also I noticed King slipping in a lot of references to older pop culture and to literature, which I quite enjoyed. So that was a great start to If It Bleeds. I'm not sure whether I'm going to read more of this coming weekend. The next one is called The Life of Chuck, but I may very well do that. Stephen King is sort of I wouldn't call him a guilty pleasure read, but he's one of the authors I go to when I just really need to relax and I want to sort of block out reality with a fantasy world. He is an author that I find very easy to fall into, to slip into. There have been days when, especially during my graduate studies, I would spend a Saturday and I would just lie in bed and read, 2 of his novels back to back without doing anything else that day. And it's been sort of hit or miss with his more recent books. There's been some, like The Outsider, that I didn't particularly like, but If It Bleeds is excellent so far. And I did dip into some more of Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex last night. She was talking about materialism and history in that chapter, and how the social relationships between men and women may have come to be. If I understood the chapter correctly, she was sort of advocating for this view that because women traditionally gave birth and spent time raising children, sort of the only compatible thing for those with uteruses, those who are giving birth, to do would be to stay home and to keep the house and to take on this very domestic role where you're not really creating anything. You're living day to day. Every day is the same. And maybe I'll actually pull open my notebook here. I was taking some notes, as I do when I read something like that. And she says, to give birth and to breastfeed are not activities, but natural functions. They do not involve a project. And she goes on to argue that because man has been an inventor since the beginning of time, even going out and picking up a stick to knock fruit or nuts from trees or to create an axe, that's a way of inventing. Because of that, he tests his own power, he posits ends and projects paths to them, and he realizes himself as existent. And so it's this idea that women are living day to day, whereas men are existing, which goes very much into that idea that emerges in existentialism, I think. She says here, because housework alone is compatible with the duties of motherhood, she is condemned to domestic labor, which locks her into repetition and imminence. Day after day, it repeats itself in identical form from century to century. It produces nothing new. By transcending life through existence, man guarantees the repetition of life. By this surpassing, he creates values that deny any value to pure repetition. Maintenance of life becomes activity and project for man, while motherhood left woman riveted to her body like an animal. It is because humanity puts itself into question in its being that is, values reason for living over life, that man has set himself as master over woman. And so I think that's essentially what she's arguing, is because men have been the creators of culture, at least from this perspective, that that is how they came to be master over woman, whereas women were dealing with the day-to-day type of things. Whether you take her argument here as fact, I do think it's very interesting that she notes that in most societies we tend to value a reason for living over life itself. And I don't know if I understand everything I'm reading in Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which I think is why it's taken me so long to continue to read it. I struggle every time I pick it up, partly because I don't quite get her arguments in some places, and partly because I find the text extremely dry. It's not like her other works, which have a literary feel to them. It's just tiresome to get through. Not that I don't want to read it. I do want to read it, which I mean it's still on my reading table, which I think speaks volumes to that. But, I approach it through the lens of, it's more of a historical work. Not everything that she's going to be writing here is completely accurate, but I'm sure it will be thought-provoking. As you can see there, she definitely has sort of a binary view of sex and of gender as well. I'll continue on with that. I think the only reason that I really want to read it is because I've read almost everything else by Simone de Beauvoir. I talk about Simone de Beauvoir a lot, but it almost feels wrong not to have read what is considered, her key work, her most famous work, the thing that makes her memorable in our society. It seems a bit wrong to have not touched that at all while I've read and almost obsessed over some of her other works. And, in the long run, she's a very problematic person, and yet her writing style and the way she approached the world and philosophy and literature are extremely attractive, and I think that's why I continue on reading her. So I've got a few things on the go. I am not sort of rushing to finish anything. I guess I should mention I'm also listening to Robinson Crusoe on audiobook. I'm about a third to a half of the way through that. It definitely is slow going. I think it's something that is all right to listen to while I walk, but I don't think I would do very well if I sat down with the book itself. It's very dry. Him telling about his day-to-day, how he made raisins from grapes, how he tamed the goat, how he built a small raft, how he built a wall, how he dug out his cave, and then of course the key moment that everyone talks about when he finds the footprint on the beach. That's when things begin to become a little bit less mundane. And it's funny because this book has come into conversation quite a bit with my one friend who I see frequently, Jasmine. And it's just come up in casual conversation. I don't normally talk too much to her about what I read because she's not very much of a literary person. She doesn't understand this whole bookish life going on around me, but we were talking the other day and I brought up the thing about the ink. So he manages to do all these miraculous things on the island. He is growing, barley and rice. He is taming goats. He is storing up food for himself. He is surviving. He is, taming all sorts of animals. But he makes a comment about being almost out of the ink that he took from this salvaged ship and not being able to make any more or find anything to use to write with. And I was just sort of like, really? There are any number of substances that you could find in nature that you could dip your pen in to use to write with. At the very least, all those animals you're killing, use the animal blood or berry juice or something like that, charcoal from the fire. Doesn't matter what, but surely there must have been something he could write with. And maybe he figures this out later on, but there are some things that are quite unbelievable in Robinson Crusoe, but it's an interesting story all the same, and something that I'm glad I'm reading, given its prominence in the language of our culture. And on a slightly different note, there is another book called The Swiss Family Robinson, which I found out, we're reading something recently about book collecting, was originally published under the title The Crusoe Family, rather than the Swiss Family Robinson. The Robinson Crusoe family or something like that, which was clearly drawing on the story of Robinson Crusoe, but instead of, a single man shipwrecked, it's the whole family. And I don't think I've ever actually read The Swiss Family Robinson, but I do recall seeing the Disney movie live action adaptation that was filmed in the 50s or the 60s, I think. The one with the guy who played Dano in the original Hawaii Five-0. But as I said, that's what I'm reading. Do let me know in the comments below what you're reading this weekend, and whether you have anything exciting going on.